I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I know. All right.
I'll make a motion to approve the agenda.
We have a motion by Councilmember Henry.
I'll second.
We have a second by Councilmember Sayre. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. All right. Residents' comments and questions for anything that's not on the agenda. I know what Annette's here for. It's for something that's on the agenda, so we will move on to presentations and reports, the certified levy concept from our friends from WSB.
All right. Thank you, Honorable Mayor, City Council. It's glad to be back in front of you here today to show you what we've been working on over the last couple of months. Brought with me Heather Nelson. She's the project manager, and she'll probably do the bulk of the presentation this evening. But I just wanted to walk with you a little bit through some of the background information. We've gone through the previous studies and information that the city staff has acquired for us to review. We've also looked at the deficiencies, and we've developed a concept plan and a preliminary cost estimate for the levee improvements, and also put together kind of a one-page leave behind we could use in some of our funding efforts going forward. So by way of background, one of the first things we looked at are some of the historical characteristics of downtown Carver. I think it's very important to establish that. One of the things we're struggling with is trying to put a monetary value to the historical nature of the downtown area here. We've talked to the Minnesota Historical Society. We've talked to a couple of architectural and archaeological folks to see if we can't find a value that, at least a range that we could make has a value to the state of Minnesota, the historical nature of the community. So we're still working on that piece, and we'll continue to do so. Approximately 55 properties behind the levee that have some sort of infringement on what they can do for improvements. They limit that to 50%. They're located within the floodplain. And then also, we're currently have looked at a lot of the Army Corps and FEMA standards, and we'll get into some of those things and some of the potential design for the levee to accommodate those requirements. So I just want to talk a little bit and brief about what freeboard is, and that's really the key measurement that we have for ensuring that you have a certified levee. It's one component, but that big piece is making sure that you have 3 feet of that freeboard, which is the elevation from the 100-year high water level or the flood of record on the Minnesota River and the top of that levee. We have to maintain that or more in order for that levee to be certified and allow for those areas behind on the landward side of the levee to be removed from the floodplain. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. So, and with that, I'm going to give that to Heather to walk through the deficiencies and the various elements of the levee.
All right, so I'll walk through a few of the deficiencies that we've identified and tried to summarize. As Todd mentioned, freeboard was kind of a big one. The maps that we handed out are probably a little bit better to look at than the presentation, but it's along the levee length, it's the yellow segments that you see. That's where it's not meeting that 3-foot freeboard. Most of those areas, it was within a foot, so it was maybe like it needed 1 more foot of fill. Another requirement for FEMA and the Corps of Engineers is to maintain a 15-foot clear zone. So that clear zone is 15 feet from the base of the toe of the slope. So it's kind of depicted pretty well in this graphic here. That clear zone needs to be free of any vegetation, such as like brush and trees. They want it to be a maintained mowed grass so that it can be easily inspected. Also needs to be free of any structures. So any buildings, sheds, anything like that. So this was kind of a big one. There's quite a few, there's obviously a lot of development right along the levee. So On the river side of the levee, there's a lot of brush and trees, so we're accounting for that in our cost estimates and things like that to clear those areas. The purple areas on this map depict structures that are within that 15-foot, or what we've estimated. Most of our work that we did was really a desktop analysis. We didn't go out there and actually walk and measure. So the purple structures are, what we've estimated are areas that are within that 15-foot clear zone. Another requirement for certification would be slopes. So the Corps of Engineers does allow for slopes that are a 2-foot horizontal or vertical to 1 foot horizontal, but they need to be lined with a riprap enforcement to be maintained. Otherwise, they would probably prefer a 3-to-1 slope, which would be an easily mowable slope. Anything steeper than a 3-to-1 is really difficult to mow. Can be done, but you need special equipment for that. So this map does show kind of color-coded. So the dark orange areas are areas where we've identified that the slopes are steeper than a 3-to-1. So they're steeper than that mowable slope, but they are less than a 2-to-1. Then the areas that are red on this map are steeper than a 2-to-1 slope, which is not allowed at all by the Corps of Engineers. So this is where we're trying to kind of come up with some ideas as far as, you know, how we can correct these slopes, how we can correct these deficiencies, and what we're going to include in our concept plan. Seepage is another issue that just needs to be reviewed. We did review soil borings that have been historically taken in the area, and it did indicate that much of the native base material below the levee would be a sand and gravel type of material, which would easily, water would easily flow through that. So this picture kind of depicts like where if the flood level surface is high on one side of the levee, there's potential for that water to seep through and kind of bubble up or heave up on the other side of the levee. So what we would propose to do is you can either do cut-off trenches or you can do all sorts of things. What we're proposing is to do a toe drain. So it'd be a rock trench with a drain tile in it to kind of capture that water before it would potentially bubble up. Easements is another big one. The Corps does require that the city would have an easement over that entire levee area. The yellow parcels that we're indicating on this map are just an estimate of the parcels that would be required to have easements. I know that there's maybe been initial talks with the Fish and Wildlife Service about dedicating some of their land to easements for the levee, and they have a lot of the land that's, I don't know if there's a pointer on this or not. Oh yeah, okay.
It won't work with
It
that
doesn't work on the
screen.
TV, okay. They have a lot of the land that's on the riverside, kind of the north end of the property.
Does Carver own the south, towards the south side? Go back, oh,
Yep.
even on that one. If you look at the south side of the map, does the city own on the back side of the levee, right down here? Or is that
I think-
DNR, or is that Fish and Wildlife?
Is that the Minnesota Valley Trust? Or,
About the parcels that you can see on the map right below the trail levee now, like
Big
behind
t-
where my old house was.
There are some sections that are owned. There's the county GIS system has it as undefined. The city believes it's ours, but Aaron is actually going through a process with the city attorney to validate that. A title search, I guess that's what it's called.
Excuse me.
So we can jump into our concept plan and kind of how we developed it and how we're trying to depict a cost associated with a lot of these improvements that would correct the deficiencies that are along the levee. I think this will still work here. Okay, so what we tried to do is we tried to lump together similarities along the levee and come up with a standard typical section so that we could try and simplify it a little bit, if that makes sense. So if there was areas that needed that 1 foot of fill or freeboard, requirement, also maybe needed some slope corrections, we tried to color code those. And that's really what we did on this map. So the colors on the monitor probably don't show up very well, but so like the blue, you can see on here we're adding additional fill on the top to correct freeboard. This one we're also correcting some of the slopes. So those slopes were steeper than a 3-to-1 slope, so we're kind of actually pushing that toe of the slope out towards the river to lay those slopes back to a 3-to-1 more manageable slope. We're also adding that subsurface toe drain on the town side of the levee, and we're identifying those clear zones so that we can make sure we're accounting for any clearing and grubbing or that sort of thing. So what we did for this is we looked at what the cost of this is per lineal foot so that we could correlate that to the length of the levee and depending on what correction needed to be done where. So for this typical section, we have a lineal foot cost of $305. In your packet, you should have gotten a lot of the detail as far as how we came up with those costs. But if you have any questions, just let us know.
Do you know, out of the total length of the levee, how many linear feet or what percentage fall in the blue bucket?
We do. It's summarized at the end.
Is it?
Yep. So it's summarized on the cost summary, so we can get to that, or if you want, I can go through some
Let me
of
go
that.
through there and see if that answers my question.
Okay.
You keep going.
While she's doing that,
Yep.
does the price, I appreciate you breaking all of these out. Do the lineal foot prices include repaving the levee, the trail?
Yes,
Okay.
it includes removal and replacement of that trail along the entire stretch. Even if we're not adding that additional fill on top, we're including that price just so that you're left with a nice paved trail.
Yeah, any construction we do on the levee is going to destroy that trail. I mean, they're going to be running heavy equipment across the top of it during construction. So the assumption was that we just need to replace the entire trail when we're done.
Thank you.
All right, the next section is the pink color, and this one is similar where we're adding additional fill on the top to meet our freeboard requirements, but you can see on the town side of the levee we're adding a sheet piling wall, and that's in order to meet that 15-foot clear zone. So this typical section is identified in those areas where we are really close to some of those existing buildings. To try and maintain that 15-foot clear zone.
Even though those buildings are on the National Historic Registry, that doesn't give us any leeway with the toe of the levee.
There could be a variance.
Yeah, there could be some architectural variances for that, but for cost estimate standpoints and trying to look for funding and those types of things, we wanted to present something that met all of the requirements at this point in time to get us that 15-foot that's required. To ask for those variances ahead of time, I think, is a little premature. If we get into the design and we say that we can save $500,000 or something like that by having those variances,
Okay.
we can talk about that and through the permitting process with the Corps and FEMA.
Okay.
The other thing that I wanted to bring to your attention is in the cost estimates, we chose sheet piling, which is really just steel sheeting that's driven into the ground. Mm-hmm. It's probably the most expensive way to do this. So if we changed it to another method like a block wall or something like that, the cost would come down. We wanted to be conservative at this stage of the program because we know that there are other things that will make up for that. We may find parts of the levee that are completely constructed of the wrong material, and we may have to hollow out chunks of that. So this cost here would make up for some of that as well. So that's why we've chosen this particular option at this time.
Okay. One more question. So on this pink section, what we're doing here is making sure we don't have to remove the buildings, the purple buildings. Got it.
Yeah, and I was going to mention too, I mean, some of those buildings, like that toe of the existing levee, I mean, goes so close that to maintain it properly, it's kind of a safety issue too. So it would be helpful to create that clear zone.
Okay.
I have a question. Can you expand a little bit on this subsurface toe drain? So is it actually just like in theory that's the edge of the toe, or is it a physical like component already to the drainage system, or it's something that would be added?
It would be added. Yep. So it would be. I don't know if you want to try.
So the toe drain would actually be constructed along the landward side of the levee and come into your lift station. And the reason for the toe drain is what happens when that water from the river wants to go through that sand and gravel. One of the ways that levees fail is that it starts to bubble on the landward side. And as it bubbles, it takes material from under the levee and throws it out on the landward side. And over time, that creates a big hole, and then the levee collapses above it, and that gets washed into the town. So what the toe drain does is, as that water comes through, you have these heavier gravels that can't be washed away by the rate at which it passes through. So they're heavy enough that they won't get bubbled out. And it catches that water before it reaches the surface, so that it doesn't just come up and start bringing up all those fines and sands and cause it to fail in that manner. So the toe drain is something that in this situation with the sands and gravels underneath the existing levee that we anticipate the Corps will require us to put in.
So is there currently any toe drain?
There is no current toe drain.
And so in this proposal, it would be from the top to the bottom, or it would run along the whole levee?
Yep, run on the landward side on the levee, yep.
Thank you.
All right, the green segment, we can go through all of these. I think it's helpful. This one is a very small segment. It's right along where there's existing riprap, and it's really kind of right at where the river really necks down there. So it's kind of a constraining point of the river. We don't want to do anything with that existing riverside toe of the slope. That would be work in the floodway of the river, and we want to maintain volumes for the current river flow. So we would be essentially just making sure that the riprap was placed at a 2-to-1 slope that was an acceptable slope, and then adding freeboard height to it. Replacing the trail, and because of the 2-to-1 slope, we are showing a railing or some sort of protection at the top, just because it's a little steeper slope than maybe acceptable to a typical trails construction. And on the town side on this one, we would just be, again, just laying back some of those slopes.
Are you intending to put a railing, like on this one where there's a home here and you have, well, there's a few slides back, but to put a railing on all of the ones that are 2-to-1? Or
Yep, it would be for that length. Yep. So it's that green and then the white sections.
Sure, and that means here, let's say on this one where the house is, and let's just say this was a 2-to-1, because you showed a previous slide that it was 2-to-1.
Yep.
So you would want a railing at the top of that also, even if it's on the house side? Okay. I didn't see one on there, I don't think. Can you go back a
No.
few slides?
Yeah,
go to the
it was
pink.
a 3-to-1 slope on the house side.
Keep
Yep.
going, please, if you could go back.
There's only 2 that are, okay.
This one.
This one, yeah.
Yep, that's a 3-to-1 slope, and then there's the retaining wall length or height, but
Oh, I see. Okay,
Yep.
so even though it's 3-to-1 from the top of that, this, we're not planning on putting any type of railing on that side?
no.
Okay, thank you.
There's some general trail design standards that we have to meet, and we follow the federal guidelines for trail design. Your slope is less than 3-to-1, you can put a railing in. You don't have enough freeboard.
Okay.
Not freeboard.
clear zone.
Between the edge of the trail and then that slope.
This one is pretty similar to the last slide that we just showed, but again, it's running along the areas where we have existing structures, so we're adding that sheet piling or some sort of vertical wall to create that clear zone. This one is kind of a basic one. We're meeting freeboard, so we're not adding fill to the top, but just really adding some fill to the sides to lay the slopes back. And then this one is the one that runs through along Spring Creek, kind of through the backyards of the downtown area. And what we were trying to do here is to make sure that we're maintaining freeboard, that we are handling the slopes, because there's a lot of slope issues in through there. A lot of those slopes are like a 1-to-1 slope. So this, we were trying to make sure that we were managing the slopes, the clear zones, and the freeboard issues.
It also allows us to get a little more natural pond to that creek, because we're actually making it a little bit wider through there, the creek itself. So it becomes more of an amenity, and as you see, we've kind of shown some areas where you might be able to have some patio space or some sidewalks or walking areas, almost a river walk kind of viewpoint in the back area there. Right now, it's kind of limited with the large stone and the riprap. It does have increased capacity because it is a little bit wider stream to carry those flows from Spring Creek.
So those are the 6 typical sections, and like I said, we detailed out the cost for each of those based on a lineal foot. So this table here was summarized.
Yes, this is what I wanted.
This wasn't included before. We included that today, so I'm glad that you guys got that printed off and summarized in your packet today. So percentage-wise, we didn't look at it percentage-wise, but it should give you the total footage for each typical section, and then I broke it out onto what the cost was based on each typical section.
So are all of these sections necessary if we are going to go for that certification? So every one of these is a must?
In some form or matter, yes.
Okay. I'm not saying we are married to, it is 370,000. I'm just saying that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
All of the sections that we came up with they correct the deficiencies in some way. Now, there's different ways that can be done, and I think the sheet piling is probably the only alternative. I guess like the toe drainage, there's different alternatives that we could do for that, and that would be kind of determined when we do the geotech and the final design. It might be a case by case, but essentially, yes.
Okay.
Everything that's shown is required.
Okay, I just want to make sure it's not something that we can say, well, 1 through 5 is great, but 6 maybe not, because we need all of them.
Yes, you need all of them. Yep.
Good
Can
clarification.
you explain where the difference is between, is it construction and design between the 5.3 and the 9.4 that
Yes.
we had in our packet? Okay, there we
Okay,
go.
so
Thank
this
you.
is the next one. If you want to.
Yeah, I'll walk through the costs here a little bit. So when we talk about the levee improvements, those are the cross sections we just looked at on the physical changes to the levee. So there's about $5.3 million in those improvements. The related flood improvements are really dealing with the roadways, so those are temporary floodgates. Those are things that we would place out there. We'd put aluminum stop logs in those locations so they're easily retrieved and placed and maintained. And then the construction contingency, at this phase, we're really at kind of a feasibility level or concept level. So we want to be strong on some of our contingencies because we have not done the soil borings. This was the approach we went down. So we've got a 30% contingency of $1.7 million. And then the indirect, we keep that even up a little bit higher. And we also know that there's going to be some land acquisition costs that I'll get to. So there's going to be some appraisals and attorney's fees. And we started putting some preliminary numbers together on that. So we think that 25% is probably a reasonable number with all the work that still will have to go into it at about $1.4 million. That includes construction, inspection, and survey, and the work to get it through FEMA for certification. And then we've got about $380,000 in land acquisition that we've preliminarily identified. Now, those numbers that we have given you today are numbers that we hope will go down as we walk through the process, not go up. And so I'm not going to promise that, because this time horizon could be 5 years or 6 years or so, but we can certainly gives us a good starting point, and I think it's a reasonable estimate for moving forward, and I think it's something the agencies would recognize as well as a reasonable effort for a levy of this length. So, and then we also wanted to put down there some of the property values that are going to be protected by the levy. So we anticipated under the 2017, the taxable value is about $7.5 million, and the revenue generated by those parcels is almost $150,000 on an annual basis. So this is where I talked about earlier. We'd like to get a number in there for the historical value of the community and this part. And so we are still working on trying to put a monetary value to that, because we want to get that number above the $9.4 million number. And I think that historical nature should easily put us over that number. It's just a matter of finding a basis to justify that, and so we're still working to do that.
It's a question
Yeah, go
about
ahead, Jen.
for the previous floods that have happened, that have been major events in recent history, is the 2001 and the 2014. Was there any property damage?
We don't have Councilmember McKnight, we don't keep a record of that, so I
Okay.
can say as far as damage reported to us.
Yes.
There was damage not based on flood, but based on the volume of water that occurred, so that we had, I forgot what the inch level was, but we received a lot of rain in a short amount of time, and so Spring Creek, the volume of water ended up kind of pulling away from the levee.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't as a result of floodwaters backing up. It was just the rate of that water coming down Spring Creek, and then associated costs related to, sandbagging, etc. But to my knowledge and memory of that, nearly all of the flooding damage was caused by just the volume. So we had the blowout north on Broadway, where half of that road kind of went into Spring Creek. We had the 2 or 3 levee slumps from 4th Street to Main.
I guess what I'm trying to think
Yep.
about is value, right? We're trying to put a value proposition in place to go against these costs, and I was just wondering if there was any preventable damage that we could put in that value bucket.
Not to my knowledge. I mean, I would assume that there are a variety of private property owners that had water in their basement, etc., but nothing related to actually floodwaters impacting somebody that I'm aware of.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Just asking the question.
If we hadn't blocked up those bridges, I would have
Pardon?
been, if we hadn't blocked the bridges where I used to live, I would have been canoeing out of my second-story window. But thank you for asking that question about finding value, because there's more to so when we look at the number of taxable value, $7.5 million, there's more value to downtown than just the tax dollar that comes in. It's the heart of our community, and I appreciate you trying to find the baseline for that number, because I think we would be remiss to leave something like that out of this and just look at these straight dollar numbers here, because we have a great value in our downtown, and I think we need to honor some of that.
Agreed.
The other value we are trying to look into too is, once you have a certified levy, the values of those properties will increase
Correct.
naturally. 1, because they're more marketable. 2, they don't have limits on what can be invested in those properties to bring them back up and modernize them and to repair them. So that's another analysis we're looking at, is we're looking at communities that have recently had levy improvements and seeing if we've seen a market jump. So that might be another piece we can look at on the potential value that would be behind the levy.
That was my other thought. Go ahead.
Just before we get too far into the discussion, Annette, do you have any comments? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I want to give you the opportunity.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
Joy, oh, sorry. I wanted to respond one more thing. So when you asked about if the floodwater, so when I used to live in the house, my house was basically in the river. It was
Yes.
backed up to it. And I didn't have, there was water in the basement, but the levee kept me safe. You know what I mean? So I didn't have anything where it broke through or I had anything like that happen. So the river was contained behind that levee.
Okay.
Thank God.
Right,
So,
absolutely. I was just wondering if we could put a value on, if we do this, right, certification, what could we prevent from happening if we did nothing, right? Compare it against the do-nothing scenario. So just thank you about the potential value, because that was my other thought about value.
Just a couple of questions that I had. Can you guys go back one slide to where it breaks down each of the sections? That section 6 along Spring Creek appears to be the biggest chunk out of this. I know at one point we discussed improvements to that section of the levee versus, I don't remember the term, maybe a gate well structure or something further down. I assume that this is the, relatively speaking, cheaper option?
Well, there were a couple of options that we initially looked at. One was putting a gate well structure in, and then when you do that, you have to put a pump there, a large lift station to pump that water from Spring Creek over. We evaluated the flows from Spring Creek based on some of the studies that have been done for the city, and that flow, we adjusted it for the new rainfall tables, and the size of that lift station became very large. I mean, it was 400 or 500 CFS minimum, and that's cubic feet per second. That is an extremely large flow, and so you would be paying probably about the same, and then you'd have ongoing maintenance of that lift station. You'd be dependent on a mechanical device for your flood protection in your downtown. So you have a higher level of risk for the same cost. So it's better to have a lower level of risk with less maintenance and not dependent on a mechanical system. So working with the city staff, we kind of walked through and talked through that, and we've come to the conclusion that that is probably the best option. Like I said, we probably can go in and refine that, and maybe we can work with city staff to get that cost section down a little bit. We have the sheep pile through there right now. If we went with a gabion option, which is really cages with rocks in them, still looks very nice. Actually, it's kind of the trendy thing that architects are using in all the bars and restaurants these days. That we probably could bring that cost down a little bit. So we haven't done any value engineering now that we've kind of got our concept together, and we can work with city staff on some other options that might work there. That's another option to bring that cost down a little bit. I like to keep a few of those things in our pocket so that when we start getting money in, we can reduce the project a little bit, and that helps you guys close your gaps on funding, because there's always a gap you're going to have to fund in a project like this. And we can make those kinds of changes and value engineering as we go through the process. So at this point, I would encourage us to try to stay at the 9.5 and see if we can get the value up around that 9.5 or a little bit higher. Then we can work with our funding partners to see if that's a problem. And then we can come back and value engineer if they say, you know, we think your cost-benefit ratio needs to be a little bit better. We can come back and lower those numbers a little bit. It's important to have that ability to negotiate as we go through this process, too. You may have to give up a few things, and if you've given up everything before you ask for it, you have nothing left to give up, and you lose your negotiating position with the other agencies. So it's a strategy.
Okay. Annette, I see you just a second. You just said go back to funding partners. Talk
Yes.
more about that, please.
So this is the one-page document that we've initially put together, and this is really something that we've had success with in talking to our legislators and various funding partners for participation. I think Brent has already reached out to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they are amenable to giving us the easements for that segment from basically, I think that's Casey's down south to the old railroad bridge, and in exchange for some other parcels. So we'll work through that. The Minnesota Department of Natural Resources is certainly something that we will sit down with very shortly here and walk through what we've presented you tonight. Both the Division of Waters, which would be Kent Locusmo and Pat Lynch, we will chat with them. They manage the flood damage reduction program. We will also sit down with the flood floodplain representatives and go through what we've proposed here to just make sure that they're aware of what we're looking at in Carver and get their suggestions for any modifications that they might want to see for the levee that would pass the certification test. And then we can work with other landowners like the Minnesota Valley Trust. They have some pieces that we would like to talk about that might make construction a little less expensive in a few places. If we can shift that levee just a hair towards the river in a few locations, that can save some of that sheet pile on the city side. We just push it over a little bit instead of driving that sheeting in. It's a lot cheaper to buy dirt than it is steel. And it's easier to maintain in the long term. So these are Lower Minnesota River Watershed District. We have not reached out to them to see if there's an interest. Flood protection is one of their goals, and so Carver is an important part to that. And then obviously any state legislative efforts that the city would like to take on.
One question when we're talking about the number 6, we'll call it number 6. Is there any cost savings to, I know we have a more natural bottom here, to having a culvert going through this area rather than leaving it a natural and trying to work with the slopes that are there?
Yeah, we looked at that quite a bit. There are some concerns if we put that, and that was one of our first ideas was let's put Spring Creek in a culvert and put it to the river. And when I talked to another person in my office, he happened to be the Public Works Director for South St. Paul, and they recently went through their levee certification. And they had a number of those systems where that pipe ran through the levee, and they had to meet all kinds of pressurized conditions, and it drove up the cost of their levee, and it also drove up the expense of maintaining it for a long period of time. And the other piece is there is a lot of fall in that system, but there is some risk if we have a very large storm event when we're at flood stage that we would still surcharge that system and it would come out and run down the old village area. So at this point, we think the cost of that will exceed what we've presented there, and I think there's still some additional risk that you'll take on.
Thank you.
Annette, did you still have? Annette, can we just, because we're broadcasting this, can we have you come up and make your comments? All official-like, please. Start by introducing yourself and stating your address, please.
I'm Annette Hance, Carver resident and property owner here in the floodplain. My question is, I know from attending previous work session, I've heard that you've worked on at least, 3, 4 other types of levee systems in other towns in the Twin Cities area. And I really appreciate compensating for, or padding, if you will, the projected costs with the expectation that maybe we can ease off of those later, but making it a very conservative estimate. I'm just curious how the concept cost that you've come up with compares to the concept cost. Understanding, I know we're over the years the prices of everything has gone up, but how does that compare to the other towns that you've done these systems?
I think it's comparable. I mean, if I look at a linear foot cost, it's comparable to many of those communities. And obviously they change depending on.
Annette, can you give him the microphone? Sorry. Again, for the folks watching at home, this is something that I think a lot of folks are watching.
It's comparable on a lineal foot cost. And so a lot of these materials are the same. The height of this levee is a little bit higher than some of the other levees, and so you do have a little bit more additional cost with that. But overall, I would say it's comparable to the cost that the state is used to seeing on a linear foot basis for this type of work.
Good question. That answer your question? You're good? Okay. Thank you.
Can you comment on sort of if we were to move forward with this and certify our levee, what's the lifespan of it? What kind of maintenance would we be looking for beyond the initial build cost?
Okay. Well, really, it's the ongoing operations and maintenance. So that's the mowing, fixing any areas that you have damage following a flood event. We can enroll it in the Army Corps of Engineers voluntary levee program so that they will cover a significant portion of the repairs following a flood. So I think it's like an 80-20 or 90-10 split.
Okay.
And then every few years, I think it's on a 5-year cycle for the recertification. And really what you do is you go out and you do an inspection, and the Corps usually will work with you on that and make sure that all the components that are in your levee that allows it to be certified are being maintained. So you have a lift station, it's operational, you have maintenance records on it, you've maintained the vegetation in and around it, you've repaired any sloughs, or if you've got some animals that have taken up digging into your levee, muskrats particularly love those areas of the levee. You've repaired those areas and revegetated them, and that your riprap is in good condition for the areas that need to be armored. So it's really the ongoing maintenance activities associated with it that are your costs. A project like this, if it continues to be maintained, it should be maintainable in perpetuity. You may have some small settlements in the levee over a long period of time, simply coming back and raising those sections up, and they're usually not significant repairs. Your levee has been here a very long time, so I don't anticipate there being any major significant sloughing or failures associated with the underlying sediment, because it's been here a long time. It's not new construction.
So do we foresee any, so the maintenance standard that we have right now, do we see it's going to greatly increase the maintenance, or is it going to, Brent, do you think it's be about the same? As our non-public services director.
Right. Councilmember Bach, even though I like to pretend I'm the public service director, sometimes I really have to defer to Brian on.
Because I know we
don't know
mow it,
what-
so I just was wondering if it was going to be, if we're already mowing and doing some maintenance, is it going to be
Right.
significantly more, or maybe just a little bit more?
I don't know the scope of like the aluminum stop logs at some locations, what kind of maintenance would be involved with that. I know Brian sat in on our meetings with WSB, so he's aware of it, but I think that'd be a good question as we continue this discussion to have Brian comment to the council on maintenance issues, costs, etc.
Okay. I don't think it'll, I mean, I don't foresee prohibitive, but it'd be nice to know what we're looking at. I mean, if it's going to take a lot more, then we have to be prepared for that as we move forward too.
That was my question.
I think the one thing we did talk about was maybe the need for a new mower of some sort that would handle
Was what?
the slopes.
Say that one more time.
A new mower might be something to look at. Just it improves the safety to your staff if they're mowing 3-to-1 slopes. That's one thing that we have talked about, and it's not uncommon for communities to, with this much 3-to-1 slope, to maintain, to consider that.
Do they allow native planting, like native grass plantings? Anything that has to be maintained mowed?
It's native, but it's got to be mowed so that you can actually inspect the levee and ensure that you don't have big erosion areas and things like that. So
Okay.
they're pretty strict on that.
Todd or Heather, could you just point out to the council the areas where you have the removable flood wall? Because I know in our previous discussions we had discussed how that might work nicely with the city's downtown master plan, but I think in this edition that's a departure from that. I just wanted to point that out to the council.
All right, let me find the page here. I know.
Keep going.
All right, this is probably the best slide to show it, and because the pointer doesn't work, you guys are oriented and you know your city. So where we would be proposing to do a removable flood wall system would be at the Main Street crossing of the levee. So where it's black on the plan, at the Main Street crossing.
So that would be the entrance to Riverside Park.
Oh, okay. So it would be, I think we have 3 locations, I think, that we're showing now. So is Riverside Park towards the north and east? Okay, so it would be that location, but then also in through the downtown area, right where it crosses Spring Creek. We would have kind of 3 sections of road crossings where we would have removable flood walls.
If we're having one on the Main Street Bridge, why would we need one up on the 3rd Street Bridge?
Why do we not need one on the 3rd
Why
Street?
would, if I'm looking at the map, I'm sorry, it's a little bit small, so if I'm looking and understanding what you said correctly, so the Main Street Bridge.
Yep.
Thank you, there's the map I was needed. So we have the removable flood wall, you said there's 3?
There's 3. So at the Main Street Bridge,
Yep.
so there's 2 segments
Yeah,
there.
this says temporary, and it says removable.
So at the 3rd Street Bridge, we have temporary. Is that what your plan shows? It's on the back of.
Okay, yep, so when I'm thinking of temporary, I'm thinking of sandbags, and that is what
Yep.
I am thinking
So
of.
that, So on the back of this plan, of this sheet, it's labeled. It didn't get put on this one. I apologize for that.
Oh, there we
So on the 3rd Street Bridge, there's really low freeboard issues. It's nearly at the levee height requirement.
Okay.
So according to the surveys that we've reviewed. So those locations, we likely, depending on the flood event, you would likely be able to get away with just a sandbagging effort. I would say historically, has that been the case?
Yeah, they've traditionally not used sandbags, but just a
Sand barrier.
sand barrier. So they'll put sand and then cover it with poly. So that might be an area where, when Brian sees that, he might want to weigh in on that.
No, and that makes sense to me now, because one of the maps said temporary flood protection and one says the temporary sandbag. So now I understand. I thought, why do we need all these different block gates if we're going up, you know,
Okay.
in the river? Thank you. That's all I needed.
I have a couple questions and just really need help with clarification. You mentioned linear feet and that also ideally we're trying to, equate a dollar figure. Are there other ways to measure this, or is it pretty much by linear feet as far as when we try to look at what we're paying for?
That's the easiest way to break it down, is to just go by section and section of levee and come up with a typical design and then come up with a typical cost for that design. So as you go through the levee, that's the easiest way to estimate, is by coming up with the lineal feet of a certain design element and multiply it by its cost to construct. That's the easiest way to do it.
Okay, thank you. And then I'm more at the stage of education on this. Do we have one lift station right now, and then this would take us to 0?
You have one, well, I think you have 2, and you're currently eliminating 1, so you're going to have.
We have one at Ash, one at Broadway, and one at Riverside, and then one in, I think, Depot Park as well. So 4, and we're going down to 3.
So today we have 4,
Correct.
and we're going to 3 soon on our own?
Correct. So when
Okay.
the one at Riverside Park is completed, the one at Broadway will be decommissioned, essentially.
And then with this concept planned, how many would we have?
You'll still need the 3 lift stations.
Okay.
Yep.
And then there was a mention that it's a 5-year cycle to get recertified. Do you have an idea of what the cost is, but just compared to other projects, cities, or the linear feet?
No, it's really just filling out the paperwork that you're still in conformance. And as long as you're in conformance with that and you've done your maintenance,
Okay.
the cost would be minimal on just, it's essentially a checklist. You go through the levee and make photographs and submit them. What happens though is if you come up with a deficiency, if you've had some damage, then you have to repair that damage within a certain allotted amount of time.
Okay.
And if you're in the voluntary program with the Corps, you can work with the Corps to figure out how you're going to do that and pay for it.
Got it. And then you've mentioned a little bit about the steel piling. Are there other examples of alternatives, even though it's too early, but just things that we might want to educate ourselves on, like the difference between the steel piling versus block, or something that maybe it's going to cost more, but it would be a good investment for us? Are there things that you...
I think some of the Gabion option is one that I mentioned.
What was the word? Gabion?
Gabions.
Okay.
And it's really wire cages with rocks in them. One of the reasons that they're good in these conditions is if you're on the town side of a levee and there's water coming through, the Gabions will let that water through so it won't build up all that pressure on the landward side, so it'll let it through. Some of the big block walls, if you're constructed properly, if you've seen those where they have the giant blocks and they put them in, those are some options that might be available to us. It really depends on what the geotechnical engineer says. I know that the sheet pile will be allowable under just about any condition, so that's why that's been chosen at this point. So,
Thank you. Those were the questions I had.
Glenn, Christie? All right. I think my question, you kind of went about through funding partners. What are the next steps?
the next steps would be to approach those funding partners and discuss the project. If I was to look at the order in which I would do that, I would probably, simultaneously, you can probably talk to the watershed district and the floodplain folks at DNR, and then the flood damage reduction folks at DNR, and then your state legislators. I'd like to have a conversation with the grant folks at DNR before we approach the legislators, simply because you want to make sure that the staff is aware of the project and can support the project as proposed, because the legislatures will come back and ask them right away, are you aware of this project? Is it a good project? And so you want the answer for them to be yes, and be aware of it. So that's why I would approach those folks first.
Okay. Okay. So just, you're going to the Capitol on Thursday, right? So don't mention this necessarily proactively on Thursday.
I would definitely mention it, and I can take care of that pre-notice pretty quickly.
Okay.
I have a very good relationship with those folks, so I can
Okay.
get this off to them. But this is certainly the leave behind you would have with your legislators. So, and if you remember, we kind of took a tagline here, if you notice on one of the things here from an old advertisement. Cost for the levy is $9,400. Taxable value is $7,500. Historical nature is priceless.
I love it. Love it. Let's
As
stick
long
with
as you
that.
feel comfortable with this, that this is ready to go, that you'll have it for us on Thursday.
As long as you're comfortable with it, Brent.
Yeah, so Mayor Johnson and Councilmember Mock, we're working on Thursday is the League of Cities Legislative Conference, so we are trying to schedule meetings with Senator Jensen and Representative Nash, so there'll be a pretty quick turnaround if you're ready to, we have it on our legislative priorities, which they have, but not to this level of detail, so if you give us the nod that you've communicated to staff, then we'd be ready to go to share this information with them on Thursday.
I'll see if I can run over there tomorrow.
Great.
Bring your snowshoes.
Yeah, nobody's going to be running tomorrow. Okay, any other questions? Do you need anything from us on this, or no? Okay.
I guess maybe one one more thing, if Todd and Heather could expand on what should the council and the city in general plan for as far as a funding match? Should we be thinking about 50% cost match? I mean, I know that's a detailed question, but just from a conceptual basis, just so we can maybe set a bar for expectations of what we should be planning for in financial documents and having the council discuss and provide direction on what's reasonable.
Yeah, I would probably plan for 50-50. There has been exceptions in the past for old village areas, such as the downtown nature here, to look at some income requirements and set a cap that's based on the income of the area benefited. So there is some past precedence that's been set for that. I will talk to the DNR about that and see if this is an option we can look at here. In some of those cases, that has capped out at a certain dollar figure. I forget, it was 2% of the max capacity or something down there. So that if they cap it at a specific number, then you're in a very good position, and they'll fund everything that is outside of that number, provided the funds are approved by the state through the program. So my understanding is there is the possibility of 2 bonding bills this year. I've been up at the legislature a number of times already this year. One to cover correct some litigation that's going on with LCCMR, and the second is a small bonding bill to get some money out and some projects moving. So that's their hope on the representative side. The Senate side, I'm not sure exactly what they want to do, but I think they're looking at 2 smaller bonding bills this year, which isn't a bonding year, so that bodes well. If they can push some of those projects out, maybe there'll be a little more room next year in the bonding cycle for a project like this.
So going back to what you said about the income requirements, if the income requirements of this area are lower, that bodes better for us.
Right.
Okay.
They can cap the amount that you have to spend. So right now, if we looked at a 50-50 program, you're looking at roughly $4.6 million. That could move down to 2.5 or 3 million, and so then you guys would be capped at, City of Carver would be capped at a certain dollar amount, and then
Okay.
move up from there. So we'll work on our homework on that and see if that's a potential for the City of Carver.
And then the last thing, Todd, excuse me, if you could share with the council how you calculated inflation into this as far as when the construction would occur. Is this a 2019 construction number? And if it takes 5 years, this number's still good, et cetera?
What we assume is that within the next 3 to 5 years, we'd be building this. If we get beyond that projected life, then the inflation will drive the numbers higher. We are seeing rates come up. We have built some of that into here with bidding for that we've already sent out this spring. We've seen a significant increase in construction costs in 2019 over 2018. If the economy keeps going in the manner it is, they'll continue to rise, but if we cool off a little bit, it'll come back down again. So it's really a difficult time for us to estimate projects at this point, but I think we're good in that 3 to 5 time horizon to keep this budget.
Any follow-up additional questions? Okay. What do you need from us? How can we assist?
I think the best part for the city is really to get up there and have the elected officials carry this with your representatives. Elected official to elected official carries a lot more weight than even a city administrator or certainly a consultant.
He doesn't mean that, Brent. It's okay.
It's okay.
Gotcha.
I can convince a couple people in my home, maybe.
But there seems to be a little more glue when
Right.
elected officials take the time away from their day and adds a little higher priority to it. I certainly am available to come up and do testimony if that's what they require. But I try to stay in the background and give you the tools necessary to do it because your words mean a lot more than ours. But we're definitely available to provide the technical responses to their questions. And I think your role is really to talk about the need and that this has been an issue for the city for a long time. And it's been something that's been trying to be addressed but hasn't successfully been for a number of years. And you have a significant contribution to the historical context of the state of Minnesota in the area of Carver. And a lot of those properties that have that historical value are in jeopardy because the individuals cannot invest as much money as is necessary to preserve that historic nature.
Well, this is great. Thank you so much. Speaking only on behalf of myself, but I would guess that it's maybe on behalf of all of us. If you need anything from us, Brent knows how to get a hold of us. There are 5 of us, so chances are, even if it's a spur of the moment, one of us can be available or make ourselves available for whatever it is that we can help, especially as we kind of get into the critical funding partner discussions. So appreciate your taking the time tonight. I'm feeling a lot better about this than when I read the packet and just saw the straight numbers. So thank you.
Yeah, I agree. It was really helpful. The additional clarification and walking through everything and the reasonings why was really, really helpful to help me understand this a lot better than just reading the packet. Yep, thank you.
Brent?
Just one follow-up question for the council. What guidance can you provide as far as how you want this information communicated to residents? In what fashion and kind of from what perspective? I mean, because we can work with the WSB team on getting something similar in the utility bill, but part of me feels a little bit anxious about that, sending something that says $10 million after we just approved
I
a
think that
$5
might be a little
million
premature.
building. But I also, the anxious part of me doesn't want to have the city work with these partners and then have a group that might have some comments that they want to contribute to this and have it come at a point when we've maybe gotten legislative agreement on doing something, but then all of a sudden we have an infusion of maybe opposition to like this, and so maybe we're not as prepared to deal with that. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there and get some idea of to what extent and the time, based on your comfort level of introducing this to the community in general. I mean, I think there will be a certain amount of folks that follow the city on a weekly basis, like, Carver Flowers that will be in the
She's
know.
here tonight, though.
Right? But there will be a certain segment that will hear about it at the post office or at Harvey's or et cetera. And so, just wanted to kind of get a sense for how you want this communicated.
That's a good question. Thank you for bringing it up. I appreciate that. In my mind, so this is a public meeting. Anybody can find this, but I do think we need to be careful because I think $9.025 million will be
It's a big
$10
number.
million will be, it's going to happen this fall. You know, I think we need to be really careful. Just my initial gut reaction is I think we need to have this information, but be really clear that we are in the early stages, like as a portion of our website, and have the information searchable and discoverable and out there, and just as public as this meeting is tonight. I agree that it's probably not the best fodder for the utility insert, or I would argue social media at this point. But
Are
I'm
you
open to everybody
suggesting,
else's
so are you,
suggestions.
just to clarify, so are you suggesting we at least make it searchable and available on our website? Something like this?
That's my just initial first I'd also be interested if you guys have any insight based on previous.
Yeah, it's not uncommon to have, an open house of some sort where folks, if they have questions about it and they've been hearing about it, that they can actually come down and get the facts and talk to folks and see what the project is all about, see what the concerns are. It's really a good point it's an informal setting in an open house as opposed to an information meeting where you give a formal presentation. You might have a presentation as part of it, where we walk through this a couple of times during that time period, but it gives people the opportunity to come in and meet with city staff and even council if you're available, and talk about the project and why it's necessary, when you started thinking about it. And my understanding is this has been talked about for decades, and so it shouldn't be a new discussion, but it is something that's been around for a long period of time, and there's the opportunity with the current funding mechanisms at the state and the importance of providing flood protection to our communities that we might take advantage of that at this point in time and start to gather some money from outside the city to fix the problem.
So we don't even know that we have legislative buy-in at this point, right? So for me to say, let's throw this out in the utility bill seems a little bit premature. So I think that definitely keeping it online and having it searchable, but hearing you say, oh, now that we've talked about this, now this number makes more sense. I think we run that risk of people not having all that information if we just throw it out in a utility bill, and I think that's a little bit irresponsible on our
I would
parts.
agree.
So I like the idea of having the open house and getting more information out as we have more information, because we
Right.
don't have a lot of information at this point.
Right, I
Does
like
that
the
make
idea of the
sense?
open house
Okay.
too. I don't think we're there yet.
Do we have a timeline on when we'll have a little more information where we could start to plan an open house, like just to pencil something in 2 months, 10 months from now? 18, 28? Okay, but I think that helps too, just knowing this is a long process and it's going to be a while till we have more information.
My opinion is it's never too early to hold those things, because you run the risk of having folks come to their own conclusions the longer you go without providing information and background. And the rumor mill starts, and people have some misinformation, and they don't have the ability to hear that. Whereas you can sometimes build consensus in the community if they come in and have a conversation with folks and get the facts, and then they can be out in the community being an advocate for it once they understand why it's necessary and what the city is proposing to do, and knowing that it's not necessarily a project that's going to show up here in 2019 or even 20. It might be in the 2021 cycle. So I think that's important for them to realize that this is really a planning document put together in an effort to secure the outside funding for the community. And at this point, there hasn't been a certain number of funds allocated to the project. So I think that's an important message for them to hear as well.
I think kind of to what we both said about, oh, this is a lot less scary now that we've sat here for the last hour listening to it. I wonder if whatever we put on the website should have a quick link to tonight's meeting so that folks can, if they're interested, just link
Learn
in
more.
and that's what made a lot of sense to us and helped give us the fuller picture too, so.
That sounds good. I like that idea. Or we can set everybody down to see Annette. She can inform everybody.
But they can
vouch
buy
for
the
us.
flowers.
Anybody else have?
Do we want to make a commitment to schedule an open house at this point, or?
I would be more comfortable maybe waiting a little bit. We would like to get in touch with the legislature first.
Okay,
If that's all.
That's
if
fine.
everyone
Kind of
else-
Totally
feel
fine.
that out.
that's fine.
Okay.
So then let's say after that point, then we'll make a
I'm
commitment.
just, what you said sooner rather than later, because I don't want to, my fear is that the rumor mill goes nuts with this, and then whatever we do becomes reactionary. So I think that what Todd said about being proactive and more forthcoming with the communication could serve us to benefit in the long run. And I wonder if, it doesn't have to be next Thursday by any
No.
stretch, but maybe, like
Okay.
something when it's topical and front of mind, perhaps during the spring flood season, like, knock on wood, like we have something during the spring, but sooner
So do-
probably rather than later, even if a lot of the answers are,
We want to pick a month then and
question
not the day. Say in April,
Right
in
on.
April, we'll be hosting a meeting, and then we can nail down the date. Does that make you feel more comfortable, or you were looking for an
Yeah, I'm-
exact date?
no, I just think sooner rather than later, generally speaking. I don't know
Or
that
March,
we need
or,
to
yeah.
nail down a date tonight. It would probably make sense while we're talking about it, but
April would be,
And maybe it becomes an annual meeting.
perhaps it does. And maybe it becomes more, you give the presentation you just did with all of the updates, the great updates that we'll have made in the next 2 months. And then it becomes more open house after that kind of firm, whatever, half an hour presentation period for you.
I think we can come back and just consider this a work in progress, but this is the not fun part of it, but at some point, we'll want to engage Springstead and do a analysis on tax impact and fee impact, because just going through these open houses, that's typically the first question that's asked is, how is this going to affect my taxes or my
Right.
rates? And I don't get the sense we're ready to have those conversations yet. We've had this great presentation on what it would take, and we want to see if there's partnerships. I don't know necessarily if we're ready to say, this is going to cost you X to do it, because then I think it might stunt the actual conversation process with some of the partners. But
That's,
at some point, Todd had mentioned, if that's delayed too long, then there's a sense, and you've mentioned it too, Mayor Johnson, that if people are involved too late in the process, then they're going to react poorly.
Right.
Probably more so if they feel like this is kind of the secret plan and that there's no intention to do that. But
Yeah.
it is ultimately, worst case scenario, kind of in air quotes, is it's still $5 million, and I don't want to try to downplay that. And we essentially have that kind of project, so we have a pretty good idea of what the tax impact would be, just based on what the city hall costs. So
What are you recommending? I feel like you have a recommendation behind.
I'm recommending that we come back to the council in short order, but I think some of these tough questions related to impact and community feedback should be addressed early this year. I don't think we're ready to do it tonight, because I think there's some pieces that need to be filled in, but I think part of this process is going to making sure the community supports what's going to be a significant investment. Because this is the best plan that I've seen, in all my time here. As far as this actually makes sense to me now, where we've spent a lot of time trying to
And
figure
money.
out what this means. We have a pretty clear idea what the dollar amount is, and so I think we all want to protect against spending more time and money and then getting to a point where we could actually see the finish line and then finding out there's serious objections. We'd want to know that now and know how to either address those or take those and maybe change a course of action, because this is becoming a real thing now, as opposed to, wouldn't it be cool if we certified the levy?
Right.
Do I hear you advocating for waiting until beyond April for the open house?
I'd rather not choose a date,
'Kay.
but I do think we should come back in maybe, you know, like a month and see like how like conversations went with Senator Jensen, Representative Nash, get feedback from Todd and Heather on how their conversations went with some of these other funding partners, and then see where we're at, and then, because I don't feel comfortable making a recommendation to the council about this, but rather to have you say, these are the things that we need to do, because ultimately it's going to be your inboxes and phones that are going to be ringing, and are you ready to have those conversations? Because we could do that today. This is more of a elected official, like, when are you ready to like say we want to do this? And I'm
To me,
not,
if there's information gathering that we don't have yet,
There's a lot of
Then I
information
think-
gathering that has to go on yet.
I think knowing, and the residents knowing, besides us sitting up here, that we're still gathering information, that this isn't some type of finished project and we've got it, hidden over here.
Right.
We don't have it all yet. So for me, I'm comfortable with that statement saying we are still information gathering. We do not have a finished product or proposal. So, but we are in planning of having an open house so that everyone can get up to speed once we have what we need to present. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, this is definitely a marathon. It's not a sprint. And I think I want to make sure that I think we're all on the same page that we need to have an open house, probably easily in 2019 at some point. And I think we're also on the same page that we don't want it to become reactionary,
Right.
that we wait too long. So,
and what I'd like to do is write a little article for the next utility bill that isn't like giving all this, but just explaining the process that we're undertaking, and maybe adding some pictures and things that we're contemplating, and explaining the process, but not necessarily saying
Here's
we're
the
ready
dollars.
to, this is what we're gonna do and this is when we're gonna do it. Is that?
Well, because at this point, it's consideration, right? And
Correct.
it's review and it's learning.
Concept.
well, and probably like that marketing assessment that we had done. We do a blurb, like a shorter blurb in the newsletter that throws to the website, or that refers to the website. Yeah. Like it?
Like it.
Are you clear on direction? Okay. Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right. Moving on, there are no public hearings tonight. Consent agenda?
I'll make a motion to approve the consent agenda.
I'll second it.
We have a motion from Councilmember Mock and a second from Councilmember McKnight. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. No unfinished business, no new business. Councilmember Communications. Councilmember McKnight.
I have nothing because I was really sick last week and didn't get to attend the business council, so I look forward to your update. That's all.
Councilmember Sarah?
I haven't had any city-related meetings since we met last, so.
The business council was a little bit lighter attendance. We had Aaron there. We were joined by Deputy Sandberg. I can't think of her last name. Sorry, thank you. Who was a nice addition to the group. We did a round table. It was a lighter content meeting, but good. That might.
And then we're going on Thursday.
Oh, yes, and then Christy and I and Brent are going to the Capitol for the League of Minnesota Cities, as we kind of alluded to earlier, the League of Minnesota Cities Day at the Capitol, where we will hopefully meet with Representative Nash. We've heard back from Senator Jensen that he's going to be out of town, so that's it for me.
Our HPC meeting was canceled this month, and I don't have anything other than that.
I've got a planning commission meeting on Thursday. I'm so happy.
Why would you say something like that?
You're so excited.
So I'll have more at the next meeting.
Great.
But other than that, I got nothing.
Right. look forward to it. Any updates? Aaron? Brent? Brenda?
Mike?
Larry.
Mike, you good? Okay.
I'd like to make a motion to adjourn.
Second?
We've got a motion from Councilmember Mock and a second from Councilmember Henry. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you all.
Sounds like no school tomorrow.
Really?
Yes, no school tomorrow.